The static crackled through the radio like broken glass, but beneath the white noise, Kieran Volkov caught fragments of something that made his blood run cold. Safe haven, coordinates north, lighthouse, come quickly. The transmission died, leaving only the hollow echo of wind through the abandoned subway tunnel where their group had taken shelter for the night. Zara Ashworth looked up from the map she'd been studying by flickering candlelight, her dark eyes reflecting both hope and skepticism. She'd been tracking radio signals for weeks now, most of them false promises or desperate pleas from people who were already dead by the time anyone could reach them. But this one felt different. The voice had been steady, professional, speaking in military code that suggested organization, resources, and most importantly, survival. Thane Blackwood shifted uncomfortably against the tunnel wall, his weathered hands checking and rechecking his rifle. At 52, he was the oldest of their group, a former park ranger whose knowledge of wilderness survival had kept them alive through 3 months of hell. The deep lines around his eyes spoke of losses he refused to discuss, and Zara knew he'd grown attached to their small band of survivors in a way that made him protective and cautious in equal measure. Lyra Chen had been sketching in her notebook when the transmission came through, her artistic hands capturing the faces of people they'd lost along the way. At 19, she was the youngest among them, but the zombie apocalypse had aged her beyond her years. She possessed an uncanny ability to read the infected, to predict their movements and behaviors in ways that had saved them more times than anyone could count. Now she looked up from her drawings, her expression troubled. Caspian Vale had been keeping watch at the tunnel entrance, his lean frame silhouetted against the pale morning light filtering down from the street above. He moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned to survive by being faster and quieter than death itself. The former medical student had become their de facto field doctor, though his supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. When he heard the radio transmission, he abandoned his post to join the others, something he never did unless the situation was critical. The sixth member of their group, Naya Roscoe, had been sleeping fitfully against a pile of salvaged backpacks, but the radio static woke her instantly. Her auburn hair was matted with dirt and sweat, and her green eyes held the haunted look of someone who'd seen too much death. She'd been a social worker before the outbreak, skilled at reading people and diffusing conflicts, talents that had proven invaluable when tensions ran high in their group. Kieran replayed the transmission 3 more times, each repetition revealing new details. The coordinates were roughly 200 miles north, near the coastal regions where several lighthouse installations dotted the rocky shoreline. The voice had mentioned supplies, medical facilities, and most tantalizingly, other survivors. But the journey would take them through some of the most densely infected areas they'd yet encountered. The tunnels around them still bore the scars of their first week underground, when they discovered that zombies could navigate subway systems just as effectively as humans. Scratch marks gouged deep into concrete walls told stories of desperate battles fought in absolute darkness. The group had learned to move like ghosts, to communicate in whispers and hand signals, to make every bullet count because ammunition was becoming scarcer than clean water. Zara traced her finger along the map, calculating distances and identifying potential obstacles. The most direct route would take them through the remains of 3 major cities, each one a labyrinth of infected streets and collapsed buildings. Alternative paths meant traveling through wilderness areas where different dangers lurked, where the infected had learned to hunt in coordinated packs and where winter was beginning to bite with increasing severity. Thane spoke first, his voice gravelly from years of commanding respect in dangerous situations. He pointed out the risks, the unknown variables, the possibility that they were walking into a trap. But even as he listed the dangers, Zara could see something flickering in his eyes that hadn't been there in weeks. Hope was a dangerous emotion in their world, but it was also the only thing that kept people moving forward when everything else suggested they should simply lie down and wait for the end. The debate that followed revealed the fractures and bonds that held their group together. They were no longer strangers thrown together by circumstance, but a family forged in blood and terror. Each voice carried weight, each opinion mattered, because they'd learned that survival depended on consensus and trust. As dawn broke overhead and the sounds of the waking infected began to filter down from the streets above, they faced the most important decision of their lives. The radio crackled once more, as if responding to their deliberation, but this time there was only silence. The decision to leave the tunnels felt like stepping off a cliff. Zara folded the map with trembling fingers, her usual confidence shaken by the magnitude of what they were attempting. The safe haven coordinates were burned into her memory now, but the path between their current location and salvation stretched like a minefield of uncertainty. She watched as each member of their group prepared for departure, noting how their individual rituals revealed so much about who they'd become in this broken world. Caspian methodically inventoried their medical supplies, his movements precise despite the scarcity of resources. 3 morphine ampoules, a handful of antibiotics past their expiration date, and basic wound care materials that wouldn't last a week if they encountered serious injuries. He'd fashioned surgical tools from scavenged metal, and his backpack contained a collection of medical texts he'd torn from abandoned hospitals. The weight of being responsible for everyone's physical well-being had carved deep worry lines across his forehead, but he never complained about the burden. Lyra packed her art supplies with the same care others reserved for weapons. Her notebooks contained detailed observations about zombie behavior patterns, sketches that had helped them avoid countless ambushes and navigate through infected territories. She'd discovered that the infected responded to certain visual stimuli in predictable ways, and her artwork had become their early warning system. But her drawings also preserved the faces of people they couldn't save, a gallery of guilt that she carried wherever they went. Thane checked each weapon with the methodical attention of someone who understood that mechanical failure meant death. His rifle had saved them more times than anyone could count, and he'd taught the others basic marksmanship using precious ammunition they could barely spare. The former park ranger had adapted his wilderness skills to urban survival, leading them through infected cities using animal tracking techniques and weather prediction knowledge that seemed almost magical to the others. Naya organized their food rations with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making inadequate resources stretch impossibly far. Canned goods with dents and rust, dried fruits that might or might not still be safe to eat, and water purification tablets that tasted like chemicals but kept them alive. She'd appointed herself the group's quartermaster, and her ability to negotiate with other survivor groups had occasionally secured them supplies they desperately needed. Kieran disassembled and cleaned the radio equipment that had become their lifeline to the outside world. The device was a patchwork of salvaged components and improvised repairs, held together by electrical tape and determination. His technical background had proven invaluable in maintaining their communication capabilities, but the constant responsibility of monitoring for signals and managing their electronic assets was wearing him down. Every failed transmission felt like a personal failure, every burst of static might be their last connection to hope. The tunnel that had sheltered them for 3 days already felt like home, and leaving meant abandoning the illusion of safety they'd carefully constructed. They'd blocked the entrances with debris, created hidden caches of supplies, and established escape routes that had taken hours to plan. Now they were walking away from all that preparation, venturing back into a world that wanted them dead. The first hour above ground reminded them why they'd sought underground shelter. The streets of the suburban area bore testimony to the chaos of the initial outbreak. Abandoned vehicles created maze-like obstacles that could hide infected until the last second. Houses stood with doors hanging open like screaming mouths, their windows dark and promising nothing but death. The group moved in a formation Thane had drilled into them, each person responsible for watching specific directions while maintaining visual contact with the others. Lyra called the first halt when she spotted movement patterns that didn't match normal infected behavior. 3 zombies were moving in coordination near a collapsed overpass, their movements suggesting they were tracking something. The group crouched behind a burned-out school bus while she studied their targets through binoculars salvaged from a sporting goods store. What she saw made her stomach clench with fear. These infected weren't wandering aimlessly like the others they'd encountered. They were hunting with purpose and intelligence that suggested evolution. Caspian whispered his observations about the infected they'd been monitoring, noting changes in their behavior that aligned with Lyra's concerns. The zombies were adapting, learning from their encounters with survivors. Some had begun setting crude traps, while others showed signs of pack coordination that resembled predatory animals. The implications were terrifying because it meant their survival strategies would need constant adaptation. The detour around the coordinated infected cost them 2 hours and led them through a residential area where children's toys scattered across lawns served as heartbreaking reminders of the world they'd lost. Zara found herself calculating not just distances and dangers, but the emotional toll of their journey. Each step north carried them further from familiar territory and deeper into unknown threats, but the promise of the safe haven pulled them forward like gravity. As evening approached, they faced their first major decision point since leaving the tunnels. The main highway offered faster travel but higher visibility to both infected and potentially hostile survivor groups. The back roads would provide better concealment but slower progress in unknown hazards. The choice would define not just their route, but their survival philosophy going forward. The abandoned farmhouse appeared like a mirage after 6 hours of careful navigation through back roads that seemed designed to break spirits. Zara's legs trembled with exhaustion, and she could see the same fatigue etched into the faces of her companions. The building sat at the end of a gravel driveway, its white paint peeling but its structure intact, surrounded by overgrown fields that provided excellent visibility in all directions. Most importantly, it showed no signs of infected presence. Thane approached the reconnaissance with his usual methodical caution, circling the property twice before signaling the all-clear. The farmhouse had been someone's home until recently, evident from the fresh boards nailed over broken windows and the organized pile of supplies on the kitchen counter. A handwritten note left on the table explained that the previous occupants had headed west 3 days earlier, seeking relatives in the mountain communities. They'd left behind medical supplies, canned food, and most crucially, a hand-drawn map marking safe water sources and infected concentrations in the surrounding area. Caspian immediately set up a makeshift medical station in the farmhouse's back bedroom, finally able to properly tend to the collection of minor injuries the group had accumulated during their journey. Naya had developed an infected cut on her palm from climbing over razor wire, while Kieran nursed a twisted ankle from stepping into a concealed pothole during their dawn escape from the tunnels. The luxury of clean bandages and antiseptic felt almost decadent after weeks of field medicine performed with dirty cloth and hope. Lyra positioned herself at the upstairs window with her binoculars, maintaining surveillance while sketching the surrounding terrain in her notebook. From her elevated position, she could observe the movement patterns of distant infected, noting how they seemed to follow invisible pathways through the landscape. Her drawings revealed a disturbing trend. The infected were beginning to move in larger groups, and their migrations followed patterns that suggested coordination beyond random wandering. The discovery of a working generator in the farmhouse basement created their first real disagreement since leaving the tunnels. Kieran argued for powering up the radio equipment to attempt contact with the lighthouse beacon, while Thane insisted that any electrical activity would attract unwanted attention from both infected and potentially hostile survivors. The debate revealed underlying tensions about leadership and risk assessment that had been simmering beneath the surface of their group dynamics. Naya attempted to mediate the discussion using her social work training, but the stress of constant danger had shortened everyone's patience. Zara found herself caught between her desire for information and her respect for Thane's survival instincts. The former park ranger had kept them alive through 3 months of hell, but Kieran's technical expertise might be their key to reaching the safe haven. The weight of the decision pressed down on them all, because they understood that wrong choices in their world carried fatal consequences. The argument was interrupted by Lyra's urgent whisper from the upstairs window. A group of survivors was approaching along the main road, moving with the careful discipline of people who'd learned to survive in hostile territory. 6 individuals with military-style equipment and coordination, but their intentions remained unclear until they were close enough for detailed observation. Zara felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the signs of a well-organized group that could either become valuable allies or deadly enemies. Caspian quickly packed his medical supplies while the others prepared defensive positions throughout the farmhouse. Their weapons felt inadequate compared to the military-grade equipment the approaching survivors carried, but they'd learned that desperation and knowledge of terrain could overcome superior firepower if properly applied. Thane positioned himself at a ground-floor window with clear fields of fire, while Naya and Zara took positions that would allow them to escape through the back door if negotiations went badly. The leader of the approaching group called out from a distance of 50 yards, identifying himself as Colonel Marcus Hendrick and requesting permission to approach for peaceful communication. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command, but Zara noticed how his team maintained combat spacing and kept their weapons ready. The careful balance between diplomacy and threat reminded her that trust had become a luxury few could afford in their new world. Kieran made the decision to respond, his voice steady despite the tension radiating through the farmhouse. The conversation that followed revealed that Colonel Hendrick's group was also traveling north, following rumors of a coastal safe zone that matched the coordinates from their radio transmission. The coincidence felt too convenient to be accidental, and Zara wondered if they were being manipulated by forces they didn't understand. The colonel's offer to travel together carried obvious advantages in terms of shared resources and mutual protection, but it also meant trusting strangers with their lives and revealing their destination to people whose motivations remained unclear. Thane's expression communicated his suspicions without words, while Caspian seemed intrigued by the possibility of accessing the medical supplies that a military group might possess. The decision would fundamentally change their journey and possibly their chances of survival. As sunset painted the farmhouse windows orange and red, the two groups faced each other across a distance that felt like a chasm. The infected moans echoing from the surrounding countryside served as a reminder that their real enemies were legion, but the history of human conflict suggested that their greatest threats might come from those who appeared to offer salvation. The choice between isolation and alliance would define not just their route to the safe haven, but the people they would become in pursuit of it. The morning brought an uneasy truce between the two groups, formalized over instant coffee that tasted like salvation and burnt rubber in equal measure. Colonel Hendrick's team had established a defensive perimeter around the farmhouse during the night, their professional efficiency both reassuring and intimidating. Zara observed how the military survivors moved with synchronized precision that spoke of extensive training and recent combat experience, while her own group felt amateur by comparison. Sergeant Elena Vasquez emerged as the colonel's second-in-command, a woman whose scarred hands and alert eyes suggested she'd earned her rank through battlefield promotion rather than classroom theory. She shared intelligence about infected migration patterns that aligned with Lyra's observations, confirming that the zombies were evolving tactical awareness at an alarming rate. The convergence of their separate discoveries felt like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, revealing a larger picture that neither group could have comprehended alone. Private Jackson Torres contributed technical expertise that complemented Kieran's radio skills, and together they managed to boost their communication equipment's range using components salvaged from military hardware. The enhanced capabilities allowed them to detect multiple radio signals from the coastal region, including what appeared to be automated lighthouse broadcasts and fragmented transmissions from other survivor groups converging on the same coordinates. The realization that they were part of a larger migration toward the safe haven brought both hope and concern about what they might find upon arrival. Corporal Dmitry Volkonsky shared the group's Russian heritage with Kieran, and their conversations in their native language provided psychological comfort while excluding others from sensitive information. Zara noted how the linguistic bond created a subgroup within their expanded party, potentially strengthening their overall cohesion but also introducing new dynamics that could complicate decision-making processes. Trust remained a delicate commodity that required constant maintenance and careful observation. The colonel's medic, Staff Sergeant Rebecca Chow, worked alongside Caspian to establish proper medical protocols for their enlarged group, and their collaboration revealed the extent of injuries and illnesses that had been inadequately treated during months of survival conditions. Naya's infected palm responded well to professional antibiotic treatment, while several of the military survivors displayed symptoms of malnutrition and stress-related disorders that spoke to the universal toll of their circumstances. Thane remained skeptical of the military group's intentions, his park ranger instincts warning him about the potential for territorial conflicts and resource competition. His private conversations with Zara revealed concerns about maintaining their group's independence and decision-making authority within the larger party. The balance between cooperation and autonomy would require careful navigation, especially as they approached their destination and stakes increased proportionally. The combined group's first day of travel demonstrated both the advantages and complications of their alliance. Their increased numbers provided better security against infected attacks, while their diverse skill sets enabled more sophisticated tactical planning and resource management. However, the larger party moved more slowly and required more complex coordination, increasing their visibility and logistical requirements while reducing their ability to disappear into terrain or hide from threats. Lyra's artistic skills proved valuable in documenting their expanded group's capabilities and establishing visual communication systems that transcended military hierarchies. Her sketches captured personality traits and behavioral patterns that helped both factions understand their new companions, while her zombie behavior analysis became essential for route planning through increasingly dangerous territory. The young artist had found her niche as an intelligence analyst whose observations carried tactical weight. The first test of their alliance came when they encountered a massive infected horde blocking the main highway leading north. The undead mass stretched across the roadway like a living wall, their numbers suggesting that multiple smaller groups had merged into something approaching a migration. Traditional avoidance tactics would require a detour of several days through unfamiliar territory, while direct confrontation risked catastrophic casualties that could destroy both groups. Colonel Hendrick proposed a military solution involving coordinated fire teams and explosive devices to punch through the horde's center, while Thane advocated for patience and careful observation to identify natural breaks in the infected formation. The philosophical difference between aggressive engagement and cautious avoidance reflected deeper cultural gaps between military and civilian survival strategies. Zara found herself in the uncomfortable position of mediating between two strong-willed leaders whose approaches to survival had proven effective in different contexts. Caspian and Sergeant Chow jointly assessed their medical capabilities for handling potential casualties from either course of action, their clinical evaluation adding sobering reality to what had been theoretical planning. The infected horde's composition included recently turned victims whose enhanced speed and coordination would make any engagement exponentially more dangerous than battles against older, deteriorated zombies. The medical risks of aggressive action competed against the psychological toll of extended delays in reaching their destination. As evening approached and the infected horde showed no signs of dispersing, the combined groups faced their first major strategic decision as allies. The choice between action and patience would test not only their tactical judgment but their ability to function as a unified force when survival hung in the balance. The lighthouse beacon continued its automated broadcasts, promising sanctuary to those capable of reaching it, but the road between their current position and salvation had become a crucible that would determine whether their alliance would strengthen or shatter under pressure. The plan that emerged from 12 hours of debate and reconnaissance bore hallmarks of both military precision and civilian creativity. Rather than attempting to fight through or circumvent the massive infected horde, they would exploit a weakness that Lyra had identified in her behavioral observations. The zombies responded predictably to certain auditory stimuli, and the group's combined resources included enough explosive devices and electronic equipment to create a coordinated distraction that could split the horde's attention while they navigated through the resulting chaos. Kieran and Private Torres worked through the night to modify their radio equipment into a mobile broadcasting system capable of projecting recorded human voices across multiple frequencies. The theory was that infected individuals retained enough neural pathways to be drawn toward familiar sounds, and their recordings of conversation, crying, and calls for help would create multiple false targets that could fragment the horde into manageable smaller groups. The technical complexity of the plan required precise timing and coordination that left no room for equipment failure or communication breakdown. Sergeant Vasquez led the tactical planning session, mapping out movement corridors and fallback positions with the methodical attention of someone who understood that small mistakes created large casualties. The infected horde's positioning along the highway had created natural choke points that could work either for or against them, depending on timing and execution. Each member of their combined group received specific responsibilities and memorized alternative routes in case their primary plan collapsed under contact with reality. Thane contributed his wilderness expertise to identify concealment positions and emergency escape routes that would allow survivors to disappear into the surrounding forest if their gambit failed catastrophically. His knowledge of animal behavior patterns helped predict how the infected might respond to their distraction techniques, while his experience with controlled burns suggested ways to use natural barriers and wind patterns to channel zombie movement in directions that favored their survival. Caspian and Sergeant Chow established a mobile medical station positioned to provide emergency treatment while remaining clear of the anticipated battle zone. Their supplies included enough morphine and trauma equipment to handle several serious injuries, but both medics understood that their role would be more psychological than practical if the plan went wrong. The infected horde's size meant that any serious engagement would likely result in casualties beyond their ability to treat effectively. Naya took responsibility for managing their supply distribution and ensuring that every team member carried sufficient ammunition, water, and emergency rations to survive independently if the group became separated during the operation. Her organizational skills proved essential in coordinating the complex logistics of moving 12 people with their equipment through hostile territory while maintaining readiness for immediate combat. The weight of preparation felt simultaneously reassuring and ominous. Lyra continued her surveillance of the infected horde, documenting changes in their formation and behavior that might affect their strategy. Her observations revealed that the zombies were not entirely static. They responded to environmental stimuli including wind direction, temperature changes, and distant sounds in ways that suggested retained sensory capabilities. This information became crucial for timing their approach and predicting the horde's response to their distraction techniques. Colonel Hendrick assumed overall command of the operation, his military training evident in the clarity of his orders and the confidence he projected despite the inherent risks. However, Zara noticed subtle signs of stress in his demeanor that suggested even experienced leaders felt the weight of decisions that could cost lives. The responsibility for coordinating two groups with different survival philosophies and combat experience created pressure that extended beyond simple tactical planning. The morning of their attempt dawned clear and cold, with wind conditions that favored their plan and visibility that allowed comprehensive surveillance of their target area. Each team member performed final equipment checks and reviewed their assigned roles, the familiar ritual providing psychological comfort despite the unprecedented nature of their challenge. The infected horde had shifted slightly during the night but remained positioned across their path like a wall of decomposing flesh and insatiable hunger. The first phase of their plan unfolded with mechanical precision as Torres and Kieran activated their modified broadcasting equipment from concealed positions on opposite sides of the highway. The recorded human voices echoed across the landscape with unnatural clarity, and the infected horde's response was immediate and dramatic. Hundreds of zombies began moving toward the false audio targets, their formation fragmenting as individual groups followed different sound sources through the surrounding terrain. As gaps opened in the infected wall, the combined survivor groups moved through carefully planned corridors with weapons ready and nerves taut with anticipation. The experience of walking through spaces recently occupied by hundreds of zombies felt surreal and terrifying, like navigating through a nightmare that could resume at any moment. Every footstep seemed to echo with potential discovery, and every shadow might conceal infected stragglers who hadn't followed the audio lures. The plan's success depended on maintaining their rapid pace while avoiding detection by the zombies still streaming toward the audio sources. 20 minutes of careful movement through the dispersing horde would bring them to clear highway beyond the infected concentration, but those 20 minutes stretched like hours under the constant threat of discovery. The lighthouse beacon's promise of safety felt simultaneously closer and more distant as they committed themselves to the most dangerous gambit of their journey. Halfway through their passage, when success seemed within reach and the far side of the horde beckoned with open road, Lyra spotted movement that didn't match their projected patterns. A group of infected had ignored the audio lures entirely, and their direct approach toward the survivors suggested either evolved intelligence or sensory capabilities that their plan hadn't anticipated. The moment of truth had arrived, and their survival would depend on how quickly they could adapt their strategy to unexpected resistance. The lighthouse stood against the storm-lashed coast like a monument to humanity's refusal to surrender to darkness. After 18 days of treacherous travel through infected territories, across abandoned cities, and past the remnants of failed survivor settlements, the beacon represented everything they'd hoped for and feared to lose. The structure's white tower rose above a complex of military-style buildings surrounded by electrified fencing and guard towers that spoke of serious defensive preparation. Yet something about the scene troubled Zara in ways she couldn't articulate. Their combined group approached the facility's main gate through a clear corridor that had obviously been designed to funnel arrivals along a predetermined path. Colonel Hendrick's military training recognized the tactical advantages of the installation's positioning, while Thane's wilderness instincts registered the unnatural silence that surrounded the supposedly active safe haven. No guards were visible in the towers, no movement could be detected behind the fence line, and the lighthouse beacon itself operated with automated precision that suggested minimal human oversight. Kieran's radio equipment detected multiple signals originating from within the facility, including what appeared to be recorded messages broadcasting on loop and encrypted transmissions that suggested ongoing communication with external sources. However, his attempts to establish direct contact with the installation's operators met with silence that felt more ominous than reassuring. The technical sophistication of the facility's equipment contrasted sharply with the absence of human response to their arrival. Caspian and Sergeant Chow jointly assessed the medical capabilities they could observe through the fence, noting modern equipment and pharmaceutical supplies visible through the windows of what appeared to be a well-equipped hospital facility. The promise of proper medical care after months of field medicine felt like salvation, but both medics recognized that empty facilities could become death traps if their assumptions about the installation's status proved incorrect. Lyra's artistic eye cataloged details that others might miss. The way vegetation grew around the fence line suggested the facility had been abandoned for weeks rather than days, while the positioning of equipment and supplies visible through windows indicated hasty departure rather than organized evacuation. Her sketches captured inconsistencies between the installation's apparent functionality and its actual human presence that gradually built a case for extreme caution. The main gate stood open, its electronic lock mechanisms disabled in a way that could indicate either welcome or system failure. Sergeant Vasquez led a reconnaissance team through the entrance while the others maintained overwatch positions, their weapons trained on the facility's buildings and potential ambush sites. The absence of infected presence was remarkable given the concentration of zombies they'd encountered in the surrounding territories, suggesting either effective defenses or reasons for avoidance that they didn't yet understand. The facility's interior revealed a story of scientific ambition and catastrophic failure written in abandoned research equipment and scattered documentation. Laboratory spaces contained evidence of advanced zombie behavior studies and experimental attempts to understand the infection's spread patterns. Computer terminals displayed data that aligned with Lyra's observations about infected evolution, while medical records documented treatment attempts that had progressed far beyond anything their groups had imagined possible. Naya discovered living quarters designed to house hundreds of survivors, complete with individual apartments, recreational facilities, and educational spaces that suggested long-term planning for post-apocalyptic society. The infrastructure was impressive and functional, with backup power systems, water purification equipment, and communication arrays that could maintain contact with other survivor installations. Yet every room told the same story of sudden abandonment that left their group questioning what had driven the inhabitants away. Thane's exploration of the facility's defensive systems revealed sophisticated early warning networks and automated weapon systems that should have made the installation impregnable against infected attacks. The fact that these defenses remained operational while the human population had vanished suggested threats that transcended simple zombie encounters. His growing unease communicated itself to the others through subtle body language and increased vigilance that made everyone reconsider their assumptions about their destination. Colonel Hendrick established a command post in the facility's communications center, where banks of radio equipment maintained contact with multiple survivor groups still traveling toward the lighthouse beacon. The realization that they were part of a larger convergence toward the abandoned facility created new concerns about resource competition and potential conflicts with other arrivals. The lighthouse had become a trap as much as a sanctuary, drawing desperate people toward an illusion of safety. The first night in the facility brought comfort and terror in equal measure. Hot showers, real beds, and abundant food felt like luxuries from another lifetime, but the empty corridors echoed with footsteps that might belong to their group or to presences they couldn't identify. Sleep came fitfully despite their exhaustion, broken by sounds that could be wind through empty buildings or movement by entities that preferred darkness for their activities. Caspian's discovery of medical records detailing experimental treatments for infected individuals revealed the true purpose of the lighthouse facility and the reason for its abandonment. The research had progressed beyond simple observation to active attempts at reversing the infection process, with results that ranged from promising to catastrophically dangerous. The final entries described containment failures and evacuation procedures that explained the empty halls and operational equipment. As dawn broke over their first morning in the supposed safe haven, the combined survivor groups faced the realization that they had reached not salvation but another way station in their journey toward uncertain survival. The lighthouse beacon continued its automated broadcasts, drawing more desperate groups toward a facility that could provide temporary respite but no permanent solution. Their choice between staying and continuing their search for genuine safety would define the next phase of their odyssey through the infected world. The sound of approaching vehicles from the south announced the arrival of other survivor groups who had followed the same radio signals toward the lighthouse installation. Some came seeking shelter, others carried wounded who needed medical attention, and a few displayed the desperate aggression of people who decided that other survivors represented either salvation or threats to be eliminated. The lighthouse had become a focal point for humanity's scattered remnants, and the convergence would test every alliance and survival strategy they developed during their journey through hell. 3 weeks had passed since their arrival at the lighthouse facility, and what had begun as a sanctuary had evolved into something unprecedented in their post-apocalyptic world, a functioning community. The convergence of survivor groups had brought together nearly 200 people with diverse skills, backgrounds, and approaches to survival. Zara stood atop the lighthouse tower at dawn, watching the sun paint the ocean horizon in shades of hope and memory, understanding that their journey had led them not to an ending but to a beginning. The abandoned research facility had provided the infrastructure, but the survivors had supplied the humanity necessary to transform empty buildings into homes. Caspian had established a medical center that treated not only physical injuries but the psychological trauma that every survivor carried like invisible wounds. His collaboration with medical professionals from other groups had created treatment protocols that addressed the unique challenges of post-apocalyptic healthcare, while his relationship with Sergeant Chow had deepened into something that transcended their professional partnership. Kieran's technical expertise had proven essential in maintaining contact with other survivor installations scattered across the continent, creating a communication network that connected isolated communities into a loosely affiliated confederation of human resistance. His radio broadcasts had become a beacon of hope for travelers still navigating infected territories, providing navigation assistance, weather updates, and most importantly, evidence that civilization persisted despite overwhelming odds. The responsibility had aged him, but purpose had also strengthened his resolve. Lyra's artistic documentation of zombie behavior had attracted the attention of researchers from other facilities, and her notebooks had become the foundation for a comprehensive understanding of infected evolution and adaptation patterns. Her sketches now adorn the walls of the lighthouse's community center, serving as both scientific reference and memorial to the people they'd lost along their journey. The teenager who'd begun their trek had become a young woman whose insights shaped their survival strategies. Thane had found his calling in training new arrivals for survival in infected territories, teaching wilderness skills and tactical awareness to people who still harbored hopes of reaching other destinations or reuniting with separated family members. His knowledge had saved countless lives, while his gruff exterior concealed a deep affection for the community they'd built together. The former park ranger had become a pillar of their small society, respected by military veterans and civilian survivors alike. Naya's organizational abilities had proven crucial in managing resources and mediating conflicts between groups with different survival philosophies and territorial instincts. Her background in social work had prepared her for the human dynamics of their community, while her experience during their journey had taught her the practical realities of life and death decision-making. She'd become the unofficial mayor of their lighthouse settlement, elected by consensus rather than appointment. Colonel Hendrick had adapted his military leadership style to civilian governance, creating security protocols that protected their community without imposing martial law on people who'd already sacrificed too much freedom for survival. His partnership with Thane had bridged the gap between military efficiency and civilian autonomy, while his relationship with Zara had developed into something that surprised them both with its depth and tenderness. The lighthouse beacon continued its automated broadcasts, but now the signals carried messages recorded by their community rather than the dead transmissions they'd first received. Their voices reached across the infected wilderness to other survivors still searching for sanctuary, offering navigation assistance, supply information, and most importantly, evidence that hope remained justified despite the world's apparent ending. The research laboratories had been converted into workshops where survivors developed new technologies for detecting infected movements, purifying contaminated water, and growing food in the harsh coastal environment. The knowledge contained in the abandoned scientific equipment had been combined with practical experience gained through months of survival, creating innovations that increased their chances of long-term sustainability. Yet their success carried sobering awareness of its limitations. The lighthouse installation could support their current population, but it couldn't accommodate the hundreds of additional survivors still traveling toward their beacon. Resources remained finite, defensive capabilities had limits, and the infected continued evolving in ways that challenged their understanding and preparation. Their sanctuary existed in a state of precarious stability that required constant vigilance and adaptation. The ocean beyond their lighthouse stretched toward horizons that might conceal other survivor communities, abandoned research facilities, or lands where the infection had burned itself out through lack of viable hosts. Ships occasionally appeared on the distant waters, their intentions, in cargo unknown, representing possibilities that ranged from salvation to new forms of danger. The world beyond their immediate vicinity remained largely unexplored and unpredictable. Zara descended from the lighthouse tower as the morning sun climbed toward its zenith, her thoughts turning to the radio transmission they'd received the previous evening from a group claiming to represent a major survivor enclave located on an island chain several hundred miles offshore. The message had included coordinates, supply manifests, and an invitation to join a larger community that supposedly housed thousands of survivors and possessed the resources to begin genuine reconstruction efforts. The decision whether to remain at their lighthouse sanctuary or venture into unknown waters toward promises of a larger community would test everything they'd learned about trust, survival, and the courage required to continue hoping in a world that specialized in destroying hope. Their small lighthouse community had achieved something remarkable, but the ocean beyond beckoned with possibilities that could either represent genuine salvation or another illusion designed to lure the desperate toward new forms of destruction. As she rejoined her companions in the lighthouse's community center, Zara carried with her the understanding that their journey had taught them not to seek perfect safety but to create meaning from the fragments of their broken world. The light that guided ships to harbor had become a metaphor for their own role in guiding other survivors toward whatever forms of sanctuary remained possible in their transformed reality. The beacon would continue broadcasting, and they would continue believing that somewhere beyond the horizon, dawn was breaking over communities where humanity's best instincts had survived humanity's worst catastrophe. The infected world stretched in all directions around their small island of civilization, vast and dangerous and filled with mysteries they might never solve. But within the lighthouse's circle of light, people who'd learned to trust each other were building something worth defending, something worth continuing, something worth believing in despite all evidence that such faith was foolish. The final frontier wasn't a destination but a daily choice to keep moving forward together, regardless of what waited in the darkness beyond their beacon's reach.